Hello again. So I'm Johannes, and today I'm going to be talking about React components and theming in React. So before I get too much into that, a few words about myself. So for the last 2 years-ish, I've been doing React and React Native almost exclusively. And right now I'm a freelancer for like past 6 months-ish. And still, like in the code base that I'm working on currently, for example, we had like this thing where we needed like users to be able to choose their own themes. And like at this point, I was like going through the internet, going through Google, going on Stack Overflow, and seeing, oh, is there something already out there I can use? And I was kind of not really satisfied with what I found. And so I kind of want you to go through the process that I went through, like look at what's available, what can we do for ourselves, and like present a few solutions. And maybe if one of you guys like is inspired enough to try anything on their own, that will be highly appreciated. And I also have like a Twitter handle, which is Frostney, but it's with an underscore because like it was already taken. So yeah, just a bit of more introduction into themes. So in my experience, there are like 2 major use cases for when we need themes. First one is, for example, let's say we're using a UI framework. Say Bootstrap, because like it's the popular one, and even though nobody admits that they're using Bootstrap, everyone still does. And the thing is, if you just have like vanilla Bootstrap, it doesn't really look good. You can immediately see like a Bootstrap site just by looking at it, like for 30 seconds, and all of this blue default Bootstrap theme. And so you definitely need to customize that. And that's when you use a theme, for example, so you make your own to make people believe it's not Bootstrap. Or the other case, in like the example I used before, is if you have an application where you want users to customize their own themes, like say, all right, the user is able to select from 3 different themes from their own profile or settings page. So let's go maybe into the first example that I said, like the Bootstrap one. So we're choosing a traditional UI framework and want to use it with React. So the problem that I have here is that they're not really coupled enough to the React component. So if I use Bootstrap, Foundation, or whatever, then I'm still doing CSS. I'm still doing less or Sass or whatever preprocessor I'm using. And I'm not really doing that on the component level, but they're like in a separate style sheet somewhere. And I always need to switch between the styles themselves and the components. So as we all know, like context switching is kind of bad because it creates like a gap, like a mental gap. So I have to see what exactly in my React component maps to the style sheet that I'm actually modifying. So I was wondering if there's maybe a React way, like something like just inject style sheet somewhere and then it works kind of like similar to how we have props and context, maybe have like styles. And well, so there are some solutions out there, but before I go into them, let's go more under the hood of things and like a few ways to set that up for yourself. And like I mentioned earlier, like the process of doing that, if you want to create something reusable, let's say like a theme library or something like that. So the first thing you think is maybe that you could use inline styles. So we have like global style sheet somewhere, and then our theme-specific styles are just inline styles on the component. So, of course, I mean, this works. We've seen it, we've done it probably before. The problem that we have right here, once we have like an important flag coming up, or multiples, it kind of gets messy, like a lot. And on the other side, though, like inline styles are the only option if we're going React Native. So it still feels like a good idea to do. So I'm gonna go more into inline styles, and please bear with me for those of you who really dislike inline styles. So yeah, a simple example. We have a button, like this button has two props. One is the stars, one are the children. Oh, man. Super in the way, right? Oh, man. Right, let's try it like that. Okay. So, right. So this button, it passes in the children and the stars, and then we have like specific theme variants of those buttons. So essentially we're just composing the theme buttons out of the button, and then just allowing the style to be passed through, which works. Again, like it's not bad, but it's not super good either. The problem that we have right here is that we're kind of allowing way more styles to be passed through than we actually want. Like for example, yeah, let's say like our yellow button, it's actually just supposed to change the color of the button to make it yellow. But the problem is by saying, oh yeah, we're allowing every style to be passed through, then we can easily overwrite it, even though it shouldn't. So another question is like, how do we deliver those styles to the developer? So there are several options to, like, let's say we settle for on inline styles for now, but how do we make that available? How do we have like the logic at hand to change the themes around? So probably the most trivial and easiest solution would be to have event emitters. So yeah, I prepared like a little code sample. I'm getting out of the way in a second. So but I still need to be able to switch, use the arrow keys. All right, got it figured out hopefully. All right, so the idea is we have like a theme object right here. It's just a plain JavaScript object, nothing special right here. And it just has a property and a color called green. So then we have an event emitter. And this event emitter just has a listener and saying, okay, like if I'm just listening on a change event, and once the change happens, I'm just updating the color in my plain object. So again, nothing special. And then we have like a bunch of code, which is not completely showing. Well, all right, let me explain what's happening and what the problem is, though. So this piece of code is, so this is our button component. It listens to the state changes as well as like we had before. And then on the change event, it updates its own internal state and then changes the color accordingly. And of course, like we need some kind of initial color, and since we set up this fancy object right there, we're just gonna using that color. And then we just render it. So this is not really a good solution at all. That's because we're storing the data too much, in my opinion, because we have like multiple event listeners going on, and we still need to have this object somewhere for the initial value. Also, each theme component would need to have their state, which leads to a lot of boilerplate. All right, so going from there, maybe putting the themes in the state management, so let's say we're using Flux, Redux, or MobX, or whatever app state management we want to use in our React application. So we can then say, instead of, we're just gonna have like a reducer or something, and then in our app state, we have like a specific attribute for our theme. So let's see how that works. I made up like a little example in Redux. So, just looking at the size of the code, it's way less than our event emitter example before. So we have a button, again, like the same button, I'm just reusing that one. And it gets like a color and the children. And then the color will be passed to the background color, and the children will be passed so that they can be rendered. And what's happening here is then we're connecting the state and then just saying, yeah, from the state I'm just getting my theme color wherever that's stored, and then from there reusing it. So this is definitely a better solution than the event emitter option, but still doesn't feel like it's the best solution, or even like on the level of good to great solution, it's not even coming up to good yet. The problem is here that it feels like more of an app-specific solution than a general solution. So it may work very well in a specific app, but this is not something that we can easily reuse on other apps. So yeah, and also all of our components that are supposed to be very simple, like our theme button and whatever other component we might have, are suddenly have this logic in them, making them smart components. All right, so another thing that we might think when we're thinking about theming is, should we use context, like the experimental feature of React context? And so Dan Abramov had like a good quote, which said, so if, like on the question of using context, and the idea is basically avoid context if you can, and if you're using it for theming, then try to use it in like a higher order component. So let's go more into that. So using context on its own for theming may be like a bad option, because we have to define all of the using context. We have to define all of the context properties everywhere and stuff like that. So we can easily abstract that away in a higher order component. So let's go with pseudocode here. Again, same button. So with that, we can say, yeah, so I have this button, and then I'm just putting like a higher order component on it and saying, oh yeah, now it's just with theme, and then the button, then the color. And this feels way more in line with with how you would set up something like that in React. I mean, you can even go a step further And so instead of just saying, yeah, it's like defining the color directly when you set up the higher order component, we could maybe have like a configuration somewhere and pass in like the theme name, and then it will map into an object, for example, which will then look up our correct color for us. So I'm in the way again, I'm sorry. So, yeah. Okay. So there's a solution out there from Airbnb. And which is called React with Tiles. So this library is specifically made for inline styles. So it supports Aphrodite, for example, JSS, and React Native. So I brought, again, a little code example of how this would look like. So, for example, it begins with, we have to import like a lot of stuff from React with Tiles, and then we are registering a default theme. Like in our example right now, it will be like just the color red to keep it in line with the other examples I showed earlier. And then we're registering an interface onto that. Like here we're saying, yeah, it's in a, for this example we're using Aphrodite, but it doesn't really matter like as soon because we could plug in React Native or JSS here as well. So then we have this same kind of button that we've been reusing, and how this works is that we're just saying, yeah, I want this button style, and then this .css will resolve the styles for us through the with tiles library. And then we have a higher order component, which passes in the button, which passes in the color, and then resolves the button, binding that to our button component. And then, if we have all of that set up, we should get a red button, for example. All right, so so I mentioned context earlier, and there is unfortunately a problem when using context. So the solution from Airbnb, for example, also under the hood uses context to pass in the styles to, and like the styling for themes to its component that it binds through the higher order component. So there's a blog post from Michel Westrate, which I really recommend you to check out, which goes a lot into detail on how to use context and, well, like where context fails and how to circumvent those issues. So the idea is, like, if we're saying, okay, we have an app, we have a theme provider, and then we're using context to update the themes, like, it works great. But the problem is, when we say we should component update somewhere in any of our components, it kind of doesn't react to my context updates anymore, which is, of course, not an ideal solution at all. And there are ways to circumvent this, of course, but the idea is probably, if there would be like a solution that goes completely without context, that would be pretty amazing in my opinion. But I haven't seen one so far. Okay, so we've been talking about inline styles like a lot, and I mean inline styles work, but they're kind of controversial in the, like, so most of the people I speak to are saying, oh yeah, I mean, I would like to use this, but I don't like inline styles. And there's one thing to remember, in my opinion. So inline styles doesn't necessarily mean that the styles are actually on the style attribute in the DOM. It really depends on what kind of library you're using. So, for example, one of the CSS inline styles libraries is actually not putting the styles directly on the DOM, but is injecting them into the head, depending on which page you're on. So this kind of circumvents that whole thing and provides like a better, like, still as a developer you're doing inline styles, but it's actually resolved into real CSS style sheets. So I just want to mention, there's also like a library called ReactCSSseamer, which is specifically made for, kind of follows the same concepts that I've been talking so far, but it's more designed for CSS modules, and we'll have a great talk coming right after mine from Kevin, who's going to be really in depth about CSS modules. So this solution, I just want to show a small example of it. So it's like this kind of theming that we've seen with the Airbnb library, but for CSS modules specifically. So let's get into that. So right here, of course we are importing like our React and our ReactCSSseamer, and then we're just saying, okay, so I have this themed button that I want to have. And I know there's like a theme going on with everything being a button to be styled, but it's just an example. And then this has like several properties on it. So we have like a theme, an icon, and children. And then from the themes, it takes like the button style and puts it on a class name, and like same goes for the icon if there's an icon available. So the way you declare the theme here is you import it directly, like probably you have like some Webpack setup going on, and then you just say, okay, I'm importing this, and then I'm putting in the theme into the button, and then it should all work. All right, so I'm a bit earlier on time than I wanted to be, so if there are any questions, please feel free to ask them now.